Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first online debate lectures that are hosted by the International Debate Education Association. My name is Daan. I am a program manager at IDEA, and I'm a former debater. I think you can never be a former debater, you're always still an active debater, but I'm a former debater at universities and high school level. And I'm very, very happy that I can speak to all of you here. And hopefully some of you will also join us in the live chat as well. I want to start by wishing that all of you are currently safe and healthy, that you are surrounded by loved ones and friends, even if not physically, that at least you'll be able to connect through the various ways that I see everyone's able to connect with each other currently. And I am incredibly heartened by the enormous amount of efforts that I've seen from the debate community in the past few days and weeks. I just had a look at Mixidea and I see that there are more than 40 sessions that are ready to go as we are speaking as well. So there's also maybe even hundreds of people who are debating online at this moment, and that's really, really great to hear. And I encourage all of you to keep making use of these kind of opportunities. What I'm going to be doing in this session is going to look at how to deliver a well-structured speech. And in particular, I'll also be looking at how we can look at online debating, where it differs from traditional debating in the classroom or wherever you do your debate. Everyone has their own personal choice there. And to see how we can adapt our debates to make sure that they work best in these type of environments. That said, I want to do 4 things today. Firstly, have an overview of structuring and how you can best think about structuring of your debate speech, what rules you should apply, what guidelines you could follow, and when you should break those guidelines. Secondly, we're going to look at online debating. What are the differences and how do they play into the way you can use structure to effectively strengthen your debate speech? Thirdly, I'm going to look at a couple of exercises you can do, either at home or maybe with some friends through a Skype chat or something else, in order to help you utilize the things you might learn through this workshop. And then fourthly and finally, if there are any questions that are appearing in the live chat, I'll be answering them at the end of this session. Please let me know if there are any questions, but also please let us know what else you would want us to cover in this online workshop series. We hope to be hosting more of these. And of course, that is only possible if we know what you guys want. So please leave a message to us or contact us through our social media channels so we know what you're interested in, what your needs are, and how you can improve in debating. Let's get started. The very first debate that I ever entered, I was the summary speaker and I had no idea how this worked. I was trying to listen to lots of people who spoke very, very fast and had an enormous amount of ideas that at the time I thought were quite clever. And I just had to try and sum all of that up. And I didn't know that that was even the role. So I just stood up there. I spoke for 3 minutes. I said random things. I tried to take a point of information, even though the format didn't allow for that. And then I sat down. And I think we all start in that way, that we just give up, stand up and give a speech. And gradually we learn that there are certain ways in which it is better to give a speech and in which it is less good to give a speech. The adagium we start with is actually very simple. You tell people what you're going to say. You tell them what you're going to say, what you're saying to them, and then you told them what you've said to them. And that's really where we start the structure of a debate speech. What is maybe even more important is that we look at the function that structure brings for us. It does 2 things. Firstly, structuring a debate speech is important because it helps make clear to your audience what you are talking about. Think of a debate speech versus a book in this regard. If you don't understand something that's been said in a book, you can reread it. But if you don't get something across clearly in a speech, the moment is gone and you would need to backtrack, or you would need to ask your audience if they really got it. And otherwise, the book is, in this case, closed. So you want to make sure that you are very concrete in your communication, that people understand what you are talking about. Because if you are unclear, your judges or whoever your audience is just might not listen. But the second thing that structure does is it makes your debate pop. So it adds extra impact to the way in which you can deliver your speech. So it's not just a necessary evil. I have to do structure because otherwise the judge will fall asleep. It is also vitally a tool to make your debate stronger. How then do you start with structure? I think the first thing you want to do is you want to always think about what are the goals that I have in this speech? What do I want to get out? And you can define these goals in a couple of ways. One of them is you say, I have an introduction, I have a middle, and I have an end. So these are the very formal things that I just want to go through them. If by the end of my 3 or 5 or 7 minutes, I have at least accomplished that I put everything that's on my paper into the minds of the judges, I'm happy. But you can also look at the goals and think, what is the main key message that I want to take away? That if everyone leaves the room, they remember me for these key takeaways. And that means that you build a structure based on those takeaways. So that's the novice or intermediate and the advanced options. Let's look at the beginning options first. A debate speech follows, I think, a relatively set pattern for quite a few people. You have an introduction, which has 2 options. You give something that might be a compelling anecdote, something to start your speech with, and or you are going to announce what your arguments are. You're going to give the clearly labeled arguments of your speech. In the middle, you develop the arguments. And that's, I think, the meat of a speech, and it's also the one that potentially is analytically less interesting to really talk about. One note, though, is that what we see is that a debate speech in the middle is you need to make sure that you transition between each argument. So you make it clear that you have closed off an argument. You summarize, for instance, the key finding, and then you move on. You say things like, and then I move on to my next argument. And then you have the conclusion. And if we're all going to be honest here, most of our conclusions are very short because we've run out of time, because we want to develop our arguments. So our conclusion is often a 10, 15-second statement where we just basically go, and that's why we support this motion, and we hope that we are actually on the side of proposition. But what else you can do with a conclusion is you can reassert the main idea of your speech. Let's look then at the more advanced setup. In the more advanced setup, you pay more attention to how these 3 elements, the beginning, the middle, and the end, flow into one another. That is to say, that you start looking at the labels of your arguments. The way in which you can label an argument is either a very generic or an incredibly detailed and persuasive label. Let's look at an example. If we have a debate, such as that we should allow racial profiling by the police, which was a debate they still had back when I started debating, I think nowadays has fallen off the label. One argument on opposition is that racial profiling is an ineffective tool to try and find criminals. And that could be labeled in 2 or 3 different ways. The generic one is you could label it as the ineffectiveness argument. An intermediate level would be to do what I previously said. Why we think the police will be ineffective at combating crime through racial profiling. The third one, and the most advanced one, would be to say why we believe that this is going to be a terrible mistake, which will lead to the police ineffectively allocating very sparse resources and making the streets feel unsafe for a wide variety of people. What's the difference between these 3? All 3 of them get the same point across. That is to say, that, and I'm going to move quietly closer because I've been told in the live chat that there are some issues with the microphone. So all three of these examples get the same point across, namely that it is ineffective to racially profile. One of them does so in a very matter-of-fact way. It just tells you that it's ineffective. The other one already gives you a hint towards reasons why it's ineffective. So it gives you more of a depiction, and therefore it becomes easier to remember. The third one goes towards the impact of the argument. So it doesn't just look at what will be the mechanism of ineffectiveness, but why should I care about the argument? And if you can ask and answer that question for each of the arguments you present, that is then also the key takeaway that you're going to bring in. And the next step in structuring your speech is to make sure that from the introduction onwards, you already start using this impact-based labeling to structure your speech. So you stand up, you give the impacts of your case, or you review them, then you go into the meat of the arguments, you prove why your impacts are true, and then you can conclude again by restating your impacts. And that's the more advanced way of doing that. How do you do that? The difficulty of structuring your speech is that we all have very little time when we prepare our debate. Because unless if you are in a format where you get days to prepare, and then even there it only is true for the first speaker, it is the case that you, in 15 minutes or up to an hour, need to come up with arguments, come up with your team line, discuss things with your partner, find your room, although that's in an online debate scenario already becomes easier, and then you will have to deliver that speech. And structure might be the child you throw away with the bathwater here. It's more important you know what you're going to say, because otherwise you might as well stand up and sit down again, than how you're going to say it. So my suggestion on how to learn how to structure your speech is the following. Firstly, try and make use of the standard structure. So try and write down what a standard structure could be, such as introduction, argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, conclusion. And then make sure that you have written that down and you can fill in the structure whilst you're preparing. That makes it a lot easier to already start structuring your ideas whilst you're coming up with them and writing them down in an accessible way, so you aren't running to the table with 10, 15 pieces of paper and argument 1 was there, but there was a link and it was there, and you have to look at all these papers. That becomes very, very challenging. So I would suggest that you take this standard structure and then you build on that. The second thing, what I would suggest is that you make structure a thing you check in a minute of free time if you have that. For instance, the minute before we start the debate, if you're the prime minister, or in the minute before you before the speaker, before you speaks. Because very often you then have a rough outline already of what you're going to say. So that's the moment to quickly review whether you are going to be able to do that. I'm getting some queries with regard to the microphone. I'll try and speak closer into it. But unfortunately, that is the only thing that I'm currently able to do. And we'll make sure that we get a better working microphone for the next session. So I hope that this will be followable for all of you. And maybe the audio settings on your own computer might help there. A very good question that I got on structure, and this moves on to the pop bit of structure, is if we're giving this format of how to structure a speech to us, why is it then the case that some of the best known debates or the best known public speeches often don't seem to fully follow that structure? And in particular, they would then point to very, very well-known public speeches, such as speeches delivered by Barack Obama, or the I Have a Dream speech delivered by Martin Luther King. Why did Martin Luther King not stand up and say, I'm going to talk about why we should have a dream, and then he talked about having a dream, and then he finished with saying, well, I just told you that we should have a dream. I think there's a couple of things that are important to note here. The first of these is that certain public speeches could make use of the environment or circumstances in which they were giving that speech. So a speech by Martin Luther King was the summit of not just a civil rights march, but a civil rights movement. So that occasion already gave more weight to the speech. People already had a large amount of previous expectation as to what would happen in this speech. But the second thing that I think is very important to note is that there is a structure within the I Have a Dream speech. It, however, isn't just a structure that we just did, which is sort of a note-keeping structure or a bookkeeping structure, where it is essentially an accountant way of thinking about how do we build a speech. But it was more of a narrative structure. So if you want to make a story pop, what you want to think about is, can I build a narrative in my speech? For instance, what MLK did in the I Have a Dream speech is continuously zoom back into the current, where there were situations of Black people being denied their rights, and situations in the future, the dreams he has of a nation coming together and finally getting the rights that they had fought for 100 score years or more. And that is a very appealing narrative that you can build yourself. So one way to use structure and make it pop is to try and build it into a narrative. And one of the key narratives that we often use in debating is the narrative of overcoming difficulties. The proposition identifies a problem with the current world and highlights that that is a very bad problem, suggests that the motion is going to solve that problem and make the world a better place. Opposition does an opposite narrative of that. They suggest either that there are great things in the current world that are worth keeping, and that we shouldn't let this motion take away, or they suggest that the world is going to be led into despair by the introduction of the motion. So if you're able to use these basic story threads and build your structures around that, that's how you make structure pop in your speech. Where is this advice most applicable? When you look at how you divide which arguments you tell when. So which argument is argument 1, is argument 2, is argument 3. That's where you can use these kinds of story threads to build upon your structure. Finally, there's some technical points that you can bring into structure. I think maybe one of the biggest questions I get most often when I talk about structure in debating is, what do I do with rebuttal? Do I put it at the beginning? Do I put it at the end? What do I do with refutation that is in the middle of a speech, or that I could potentially link to my arguments? How do I make that work? Because rebuttal often feels like the messiest part of building structure. Now, I think that this feedback is, I think, a bit format dependent. I think that it generally very often works really well if you're able to integrate your refutation into your own arguments. That means that when you think your own argument can directly link towards the arguments of the other side and can disprove the other side, you should try and move it together. Why is that? Because it means that you make bigger chunks of story in the structure of your speech. It isn't just random attacks, but rather it makes sure that even within the argument, you build a structure where you're saying there are all these problems with the other side, but don't worry, I'm going to make it clear for you. I'm going to show you why we have a better alternative. Of course, sometimes you're unable to do that. In that scenario, I would suggest that clarity is the most important thing. So if you can announce, for instance, how many points of feedback you have, that would be very, very useful. But also remember the old rule set for rebuttal. The way you handle rebuttal is by taking some LSD. That stands for listening, summarizing, and then disagreeing. So of course you listen to your speech, and then crucially, you summarize in a sentence or a few words, what was the argument I'm responding to? For instance, you can use that label, but be careful that you don't use the beautifully framed label. Rather use the technical label that doesn't sound as convincing. And then you tell why you disagree with that piece of rebuttal. There are then some tips that I want to highlight that I'm not giving. For instance, many people say that you should split a speech in a certain amount of minutes. So, such as, for instance, if you have in world schools 8 minutes of speaking, you should, in a second speaker, spend 3 or 4 minutes on rebuttal and 4 minutes on your own constructive material. And I think that that is a useful scaffold to try and make sure that you don't go over time with each of these. But I also think that whether or not this is actually very, very important or useful is going to be a it depends situation. So I don't want you to feel like you have to always do a 4-4 split or a 5-3 split. Rather, think about what is most necessary in your scenario. Or if you're noticing, hey, I am always running out of time, I'm always spending way too much time on refutation and way too little time on my arguments, or I am never getting to my final argument, I always have only 45 seconds left for that, make a note of that, and then for yourself, try and divide the timing. One of the things that made me jump in my speaker points was realizing that I almost never had the time for a third argument in my speeches. So what I did then was not have a third argument anymore. I would try to make do with 2, or I would give that extra argument to my debate partner. Because I wasn't going to it. That meant that 1 minute was me blurting through this argument, and the argument never would have won as the case anyways. So I decided to scrap that. So here is also the moment where you can experiment. Let's then look at structure for online debating. What is the difference between online debating and debating per se? We still get motions. We still offer speeches. We're doing all of the formal requirements of debate. The difference, of course, is that we have less of an opportunity to show off all of who we physically are when we debate. That has its effect on a couple of areas. The first of these can be the quality of your voice. As some of you have indicated in this broadcast, is you found it hard to listen to me because my microphone wasn't as optimal as if I was standing in the same room alongside all of you. That might be the case for quite a few people. It might also happen due to, for instance, a poor internet connection. And that means that you're potentially harder to hear. The second thing that's important to recognize is that you have less of an opportunity to use your body. Making movements can very quickly look a bit weird, especially if you're sitting down, and especially if there's less room for you and for your body when you're just looking at someone's eyes and mouth and ears. And that means that you cannot use body language as effectively to strengthen your points. The third thing is that it's possible that people get distracted slightly easier when they're using online debate. And that's for the very simple reality that quite a few of us will have other tabs open or will have forgotten to zone out their web WhatsApp, so they get like a dot in between, or that they're sharing the room with someone else, or someone keeps barging in. And that means that we have a couple of different things that we need to look at when we give online debate speeches. The first change you probably want to make is you want to try and use the power of repetition. Repetition is a well-known rhetorical trick. If we refer back to the Martin Luther King speech, you see that one of the ways in which he makes such a powerful speech is the recurrence of the themes and motives, such as the I have a dream, which continuously repeated. Barack Obama has always been remembered by yes we can. That's a motive that keeps coming back. And the reason repetition works is because people, as we said at the beginning, are bad at remembering. This becomes better if you tell them things more often. Obviously, we have received the feedback very often in debating that our analysis is or sounds repetitive. One of the reasons why that's the case is because adjudicators try to be almost like perfect recall machines. So rather than an individual human being, they try to have far more perfect recall of a debate. And therefore, they need less repetition than an average human being when they listen to a debate. But I think there are good reasons to suggest that that's less true of online debating, that it's useful to offer slightly more repetition. But make sure that your repetition doesn't become repetitive. And the easiest way to think of that is the difference between saying repetition works because repetition works as it does, or repetition works because it makes it easier to remember what someone says if you jog their memory, just like we've seen within the Martin Luther King speech. What the second thing does is it stresses the same argument, but stresses it in new ways. That makes it feel like we are having to build more emotional understanding of things. That allows us to remember and makes us believe that we have a slightly bit of new information. So you're striking the right balance between repeating the key idea and making sure there's just about enough novelty that we remain intrigued. The second thing, and the second tip I would say, is that you want to check how you use your voice. And I think you want to check that in two ways. First is, how fast do you speak and can everyone follow? And the second is, how much variation are you using in your voice? Voice quality tends to be a little bit dampened if we use microphones versus when we speak in real life, either due to the microphone quality or due to the quality of your own headphones. Now, some of you might be using high-end gaming systems, and in that scenario, you might be perfectly hearable, but I think the vast majority of us are speaking into our laptops and listening with a couple of 15 euro microphone sets. In that scenario, it is the case that your voice doesn't come across as full and rich as it does in a real room. So I think it becomes easier then to use more breaks in your speaking in order to be able to use more stress towards your voice. Also, if you've been debating far often, that means that you are going to be able to speak at incredibly speeds, and therefore you often think at quite a fast level. Use some of that thinking there space to think about how you're saying things. But also think, for instance, about what kind of words you're using, because it becomes much more interesting when you use words that paint a far stronger color. Here's an example. if you use the following sentence, the natural resources beneath our feet are owned by everyone. We must make sure we don't allow anyone to use them for their own benefit. Or we use this example. The natural resources, oil, gas, that are beneath our feet are owned by everyone in our society, every citizen. We must make sure that we don't allow conniving large companies to exploit them for their own benefit. What I did in the second example was take a couple of words that sounded a bit more generic, because everyone, anyone, and use, and provided more concrete alternatives. And that made that language pop a whole lot more, and therefore made it easier to understand things. The second thing that I would suggest you do as a very practical example is, before you give a lecture or a debate speech or whatever, is to check with your room that you're clearly understandable and that they find it easy to listen to you. For instance, before I recorded this, I had a brief link up with my girlfriend who was sitting in the room behind me. We had a short welcome session just to check whether she could hear me, and only then did I start this live video. The other thing to make sure is that the way in which your body does work, in which way you do use your body language, is that you can still do things like count in order to provide structure, and you are still able to, for instance, use your face to highlight that type of structure, certainly if you're able to use a camera. So that's the other way in which online debating can differ, and how you can make the best of this type of format. Finally, I just think that we should probably go towards a norm shift, such as that when people may, for instance, lose connection, we are more forgiving for using their time, or we allow people to pre-record some parts of their speeches if it turns out that you and your group will find it more difficult to communicate online, because that allows for a better quality of transfer. And of course, the debate happens with a bit of a delay, but it can still happen. And I think that that's very important to do. Finally, I think it's good norm to try and kill all your other tabs, kill the other things you're doing, and try to focus more on the debate. Make therefore sure that you are going to stretch a little bit before you sit down. Allow everyone to stretch a little bit afterwards, so you feel more engaged and ready to do that. So that's how you look at online debating. Make sure that you adapt your message through the constraints of it, and make sure that you start emphasizing the tools you do have at your proposal. You don't have your entire body at your proposal. You still have your voice, you still have your face, and most importantly, you still have the words at your disposal. So try and focus as much as possible about word choice, for instance. Let's then look at, finally, before I go towards questions, at some exercises you could do back home. The first thing you can do is you can record one of your own speeches and then look back at that speech and analyze the structure of the speech. Ask yourself the following questions. Was it clear which structure I followed? Did I signpost well between argument A and argument B and argument C, and a conclusion of the speech? Was there any fat I could trim? So were there any moments where I was, for instance, becoming more repetitive, or I had already proven that point and I couldn't really prove it much further? This helps to make sure that you know where your strengths and where your weaknesses are. Secondly, try and build compelling an introduction. So take a motion from the internet, or take a motion such as like this house information profile. I hope you won't actually do that in real life. So I take a motion such as that we should make sure that we should, for instance, ban fake news on social media, and try to make a compelling introduction. Think about, in that introduction, what is the main message I want to get across, and which arguments would I use, and how would I use impact labeling to make that argument come across as strong as possible. The third thing you can use is to think about word usage. So what I suggest here is that you could play a game that I like to call the analogy game or the change games. The way in which you do that is you write down 3 sentences of a debate speech, and then you recite it, and then you start thinking, how can I change each proper noun? And how can I make sure that that proper noun either means that it becomes a more positive thing or a more negative thing? So in that way, you build a different structure there. Fourthly, I would suggest that you prepare a standard structure speech. You could, for instance, create a Word document template where you can fill in my introduction, my arguments, my conclusion. So that when you type it out during an online debate, you always have the template ready to go. But also, of course, that if you are then go to a debate tournament, you will then be able to bring that with you and then fill it in. So that becomes a lot easier there. That's the end of the lecture. I'm now going to look at questions. It seems that currently for me the chat is off, so I hope that there are some more questions coming and maybe I can answer them a bit later. But I have a couple of questions that I do see here. So I get a question from Husanboy Mamadolimov, and I hope I do pronounce your name at least roughly correct. He says, "Hi there. Hello from Uzbekistan. Online debates require speakers to speak with pauses and with little body language and lose therefore emotional intensity. What are the alternatives online?" That's a very good question. I hope I address it at least in one part, Husan. I think that firstly, you might move towards a more matter-of-fact way of speaking online. That's not too bad. That's a style that is different and that works for some people. So you might want to utilize more of a professorial way of speaking rather than an overly emotional way of speaking. And I think that it can be equally persuasive. But on the other hand, you can utilize the pause to give more weight towards an argument. You can make people wait for it, and that leaves a little bit of tension in the room. Like, what's going to come? What's next? So you can use the differentiation there. That can still give us some emotional intensity. So try using these pauses to your big advantage. Then Roberto asks, what about the underlying magic thing of a speech? And I think that that's a very good question, right? So we started at the beginning by already saying there are 2 ways in which we look at structure. There is the sort of the bookkeeping way, how to make sure that your structure helps getting the speech into the judge's mind. And the second one is, how does it make it pop? How can we create a structure that pops? And what I suggest is that you look at, 1, how can I build a story throughout my speech? So how can I, for instance, tell a proposition that we are triumphing over adversity, that we are solving an important problem, or an opposition that we are protecting our current society from doom? In that way, you make sure that the speech becomes far more understanding and interesting. It also means, therefore, that you shouldn't over-announce structure. There are some people who have enormous amount of structure within an argument. They will, for instance, say, okay, so in the first argument as to why we think this isn't effective, I'm going to provide you 4 mechanistical reasons leading to 3 impacts. The first of these mechanisms is yada, yada, yada. That is very useful for a bookkeeping scenario, making sure that the judges write everything down on a piece of paper. But it doesn't sound very compelling. And quite frequently, you won't have to pre-announce a structure in order to make it equally compelling. You could use sign words, for instance. So we think that this argument shows that it's going to be less effective. That's for a large amount of reasons. Firstly, we think that. Secondly, we think that. But thirdly, etc. That's still the same structure, but because you announce it in a less plastic way, because it becomes part of another sentence, where that sentence is not the most important bit, it's the second sentence or the third sentence, with the meaning of the sentence wholesale, that makes that argument pop far more. The final question that I'm going to address is a question that Thea Hodai asks. Will the judges somehow reshape their method of judging due to the shift online? As you were mentioning, body language and voice qualities will not be impacted in the same way. I think that's a very good question. It depends a little bit on the way judges currently already judge within your own community. There's a trend, for instance, in some debating communities that they already are looking very much at formal analytical language. And I don't think that these people will have to change. They might have to start paying some harder attention in the online debating. I think that there is a strategic advantage for speakers who are able to be incredibly clear in online formatting, because of the added difficulties that online communication has when there is less contextual information available for the people who listen in. Therefore, what I assume might happen is that that trend may continue. I think that there's lots to be said for some of these trends, but I also think that there is true magic in making sure that people are able to tell a compelling speech. And I think, therefore, that using some of the tricks that we talked about in this session may still convince judges and may make sure that they aren't necessarily shifting away. I would therefore call judges out when you see them not taking some of the manner into account. One thing to crucially look at here is the way that judges frame which impact they found more persuasive. Because I think that impacts can, for instance, be analytically persuasive. If one side proves that more people's life will be saved than the other side, then through cold arithmetic, maths, logic, it sounds more convincing in that way. But I also think that, for instance, there are arguments to be made about which lives we care more about. Arguments that aren't rested on a very analytical assumption. Why do I care more about a person is often for who they are. I care more about a random man on the street, for instance, if he or she is my father. And I think, therefore, that these kinds of rhetoric usages don't necessarily rest on like an analytical understanding, but on a way of using language that is, I think, very often beautiful and can help build on the impact of the argument. So hold your judges to account. They recognize that they're assessing you on other criteria than simple logic. That's it for today's session. As said, I'd love to hear your feedback. Hopefully this was great. We'll try to make it even better next time, even bring in potentially a better microphone. If there are any topics that you'd like us to discuss in future sessions just like this, please let us know through social media or through comments. And I wish all of you a great evening. Happy debating. If you want to know where to online debate, we have written an article on our website that is idebate.org, idebate.org, that shows some of the various opportunities in which you can use online debating. That's also one of the ways in which you can contact us. This was Daan from the Netherlands, from the International Debate Education Association. Have a great evening. Have happy debating. Good night.